Let's bring in John Sitilides, a political strategist with Trilogy Advisors. John, it seems that the Syrian regime is preparing for the final showdown with rebels here. Does Assad's army, even with the assistance of Iran, have the capability to overrun Idlib?
They do with the assistance of Russian forces. And this is, as your correspondent mentioned before, Michelle, has enormous potential for utterly catastrophic consequences for the 2 to 3 million civilians that are caught up in this battle royale between the Assad regime and their supporters from Russia and from Iran against the al-Nusra Front and other al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist organizations, anywhere from 10 to 80,000 terrorists and jihadists, and potentially sacrificing the lives and well-being of several million civilians on both sides in trying to see how this military operation comes out.
John, you mentioned Russia's assistance. We do know that Russia has an increasing military presence in Syria, also reinforced its naval presence in the Mediterranean off the coast of Syria. But in terms of operations, what kind of role do you see the Russians actively playing in this?
What they've always excelled at in the 3 years that they've engaged in the Syria battlefield: air cover. They're able to bomb the rebel forces in a way that Syria is completely unable to. And Iran, for that matter, Michelle, has really been providing ground forces along with Hezbollah proxies. But it's been the Russian Air Force that has been able to utterly annihilate either terrorist organizations in other parts of Syria or rebel strongholds in the western part of the country, and now potentially closing in on what remains of the rebels and the jihadists in Idlib.
John, as we just established, if they pursue this will be a disaster. This will be a civilian bloodbath. And now the optics for Putin and Assad will be awful. Is that even a consideration for them? Do they care about the global condemnation that this could bring?
Putin may, to a certain degree. He likes to maintain the veneer, the facade of democratic legitimacy. And he does have very important ties to a number of EU countries, especially Germany. I think the Assad regime is the one that we need to be most concerned about, especially in the talk about the potential use of chemical weapons to root out any strongholds where the jihadists are simply unwilling to relinquish control of a territory. And I don't know to what extent the Russians are able to sway Assad in a direction that allows for more of a phased-in series of attacks to allow certain rebel groups to potentially surrender and protect the lives of these millions of civilians in the process.
But, John, if Assad does bring in chemical weapons, does that not risk getting the U.S. involved again and perhaps another coalition?
It does. And that's why we're seeing this propaganda war that's already playing out, where you have the Russian government warning the United States and its allies, namely France and Great Britain. There are forces that are massing now in Jordan, in Kuwait, and in Greece for any potential retaliatory strikes in case of the use of chemical weapons. And so the Russians are saying that there should be no pretext for anything along those lines. And if chemical weapons are used, it won't be the Syrian government, which they pretend to not have any chemical weapons. It won't be the Russians. And they're actually claiming that there are rebel groups and their supporters that are bringing chemical weapons into Idlib in order to be able to generate a pretext for an American-led response.
So John, they're already trying to establish that chemical weapons would be used by the opposition, not by them. They're trying to shift responsibility ahead of this even happening, like a preemptive strike on that. Do you think there is going to be an international reaction to this other than UN condemnation if chemical weapons are not used?
Well, let's be frank, Michelle. The only international reaction would be a military reaction that would be led by the United States and its best armed allies. It's the way this always works. Unfortunately, the burden falls on the United States and the West to respond to these types of uses of chemical weapons in violations of international treaties or to prevent humanitarian catastrophes of this magnitude. There'll be a lot of rhetoric in the UN and from Brussels and elsewhere, but any significant, serious response is going to be a U.S.-led military response. We hope it doesn't come to this, but I think the administration is preparing now for the potential for the use of chemical weapons.
All right, John, thanks for that analysis. John Sitilides.